Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining for today's Friday Focus talk about repatriation. For practical reasons, this talk is recorded as I'm traveling as I speak. But do drop your questions in the chat. It will be saved, so I will try to get back to you after. I will be looking at a bit of the history and wider context for repatriation, arguably from a Western museum perspective, using some of my own professional experience to illustrate my talk. My name is Steph Scholten, and I've been the director of the Hunterian since August 2017, after working for almost 30 years in the arts, museums and heritage in the Netherlands. I will share my screen. And I will hide the floating meeting controls, okay, there we are. I've been interested in the subject of museum ethics and repatriation for many years, as early as in my first job at the Dutch Ministry of Culture in 1989. Because early in the 1990s, after the Iron Curtain had come down, the Dutch government was trying to reclaim the so-called Koenigs collection from Russia, that had confiscated this famous collection of old master prints and drawings when they occupied large parts of Germany at the end of World War II. And even though there were clear legal grounds to the Dutch case, to me the circumstances didn't give the Netherlands the moral rights to this collection. But as I was only a very junior member of staff at the time, my opinion wasn't very highly valued. There's a long story, but the case has yet to be resolved. A bit later, still at the Ministry of Culture in the Netherlands, governments and museums needed to come to terms with the then newly agreed Washington Principles on Nazi confiscated art, a statement concerning the restitution of art confiscated by the Nazi regime in Germany before and during World War II. They were released in December 1989. And Dutch museums held and hold a considerable number of items with unclear provenances from the wartime era. An extensive research was necessary and actions followed, including the widely published returns of sometimes very important and valuable works of art. It's an ongoing process. Only last month, this picture of a restituted Kandinsky painting made headlines. And I myself was directly involved in several returns of items to the heirs of people that died in the Holocaust. But it would take too long to go into the specifics of those cases today. Let's maybe take a little sidestep here and look at the ethical framework that museums operate in. Maybe good to first look at the question, what we mean by ethics. As you can see on the slide, ethics or moral philosophy is the branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. As a branch of philosophy, ethics investigates the questions, what is the best way for people to live? And what actions are right or wrong in particular circumstances? In practice, ethics seems to resolve questions of human morality by defining concepts such as good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice, justice and crime. And in the museum sector, the Code of Ethics by the International Council of Museums is the cornerstone for museum practice and practitioners. ICOM, by the way, is the global organization for museum professionals, the International Council of Museums. Its Code of Ethics provides a means of professional self-regulation. It sets minimum standards of conduct and performance to which museum professional staff throughout the world may reasonably aspire, as well as providing a statement of reasonable public expectation from the museum profession. Amongst a great many other things, the ICOM Code of Ethics speaks about repatriation in a number of ways. And here's some examples. The code is currently under revision, a project that I'm involved in as a member of the executive board of ICOM, and I expect repatriation to be even more prominent in a revised code. So much for museum ethics. In my next job at the Netherlands Institute for Cultural Heritage, I was involved in developing national guidance for deaccessioning from museum collections that included some rudimentary notions on repatriation as one of the means for deaccessioning. But my involvement with repatriation only properly took off when I moved to the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden. And the very first issue on my desk, when I started working there, was a court case between the museum and the Italian government, the latter claiming that the museum had bought an illegally excavated and exported cuirass. And you see it on the left-hand side of the image here. I won the case, but it wasn't pretty, and it was very clear to me that the museum had not done its homework in terms of provenance research. And it drove me to tighten acquisition policies, and in the years after, many other cases arose. And so many different ethical dilemmas presented themselves in my day-to-day work that in 2007 I decided to curate an exhibition about it, titled Forbidden Collections. And it was there and then that I was actually involved in my first actual return of human remains. Interestingly enough, in the context of the Netherlands itself. These skulls from the collections of the Museum of Utrecht University were returned to the island of Urk in June 2010. Urk was being believed to be the island where the original Dutchman lived, the Homo Batavus. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were considered to be of great interest to physical anthropologists, who went as far as to steal these skulls from the local cemetery. This resonates with a very recent case in the British Isles, where for similar reasons, skulls were returned to an originating community. The image shows academics measuring the heads of people on Inishbofin in 1892. And it was believed at the time that these islanders were Ireland's original indigenous people. I got involved in a whole number of actual repatriations, especially of looted archaeological objects from the Middle East and from Italy. And after I moved to the University of Amsterdam, where I ran its university museums and special collections. There was also an archaeology museum, the Allard Pierson, with similar issues as in Leiden around missing or incomplete provenances for quite a few items in the collections. And in its special collections, it held a number of items for safekeeping, things that we knew were stolen from places such as the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris or the National Natural History Museum in Madrid. And because of the many legal complexities, it had proven difficult to return these items for legal reasons. In the end, I was involved in as much as a dozen or so repatriations, and some of these were executed in complete confidentiality. Others made the headlines in Dutch and other newspapers, but none more than the case of the so-called Crimean gold. I could talk a whole evening about this case, but that's not why we're here. The crux of this case is the question, who owns these objects? The Ukraine or the Crimean museums that lend these items to the University of Amsterdam's Allard Pierson Museum? The case has been ongoing since 2014, when, during the runtime of the exhibition, The Crimea, Gold and Secrets from the Black Sea, the Crimea separated from the Ukraine and became Russian. The case now sits with the Supreme Court in the Netherlands, with a ruling expected this year. In the meantime, the museum is holding these objects for safekeeping. And as you can imagine, this case has drawn the attention of media across the globe and has been used and abused for political reasons in many different ways. But so much about my past in other places. In 2017, so a few months after I was appointed in Glasgow, French President Macron made a landmark speech in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso in Africa. And he said, and I quote, "I cannot accept that a large share of several African countries' cultural heritage be kept in France. There is no valid, lasting, and unconditional justification for it. And he added that he wanted the conditions to be in place within 5 years for the return of African heritage to Africa. This landmark statement was followed by the publication of the report, The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Towards a New Relational Ethics by Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, which proved to be a game changer when it was published in November 2018. It argued for substantial returns from French to African museums, and it set up a number of initiatives in mostly European countries, such as Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, to research colonial legacies in museums and to initiate new legislation, policies, and concrete actions aimed at addressing historical injustices through the return of museum objects and ancestral human remains. This development was further fueled by the global Black Lives Matter movement, which in 2020 called attention to the global racial injustices following the murder of George Floyd, as well as more local political issues, such as the death of Sekou Bayou while in the custody of Police Scotland. It is important to acknowledge that much of the thinking and practice about repatriation work has been driven for many decades by originating countries and communities, often from the so-called Global South, as well as by diasporic communities in Western colonizing countries. And it seems we're at a tipping point. Even if these and the many declarations that followed the Savoy-Sarr report had little direct impact on Scottish museum policy, they nonetheless have contributed to the growing sense amongst people working in museums that the moral force of repatriation is something they rather should embrace than resist. And it was in this period that the Hunterian wrote its new 5-year strategy, which advocates for a critical approach to its history, stating, amongst others, and I quote myself, "This 2021-25 strategic plan is conceived in a moment of global and local events that emphasize once more the necessity for more equity, justice, and diversity in our society. Many of the inequalities and prejudices in today's Western world, of which the UK and Scotland are an inextricable part, stem from a history that includes colonialism, exploitation, and enslavement of people. We cannot change that past, but we can address issues it causes in the present. For years to come, we commit to making the Hunterian a more meaningful place for more diverse audiences. And we will work with our stakeholders to critically reassess how collections can be developed, studied, interpreted, and presented. This will help generate meaningful and rich interpretations for wider audiences, as well as specialist researchers. We have an ethical commitment to provide a transparent and open process for museum engagement and for the respectful study and return of contested material to source communities. The curating discomfort behind me, you can see it in our museum, is one of the ways we communicate this approach with our audiences. But the work behind the scenes is probably much more fundamental to the ways we are trying to modernize the Hunterian. Another visible output is the rehang and reinterpretation of our collections in our art gallery that will open on April 1st, and I encourage you to come see it. So far for commercial. As part of the process, we have also modernized our repatriation and our human remains policies in 2021. And as a matter of most urgency, we have actioned the repatriation of ancestors from our collections to originating communities. Now, for even more context, I will provide some information about actual returns of objects from Scottish museum collections. An article in Museum Anthropology from 2010 by my colleague Neil Curtis from Aberdeen on repatriation from Scottish museums reflected on the then current practice, and it listed 23 known cases involving repatriation from Scotland in the period 1990-2009. All but 3 returns concerned ancestral human remains. The cases involved 8 museums out of the more than 340 museums in Scotland at the time. The above-mentioned article concluded, arguably optimistically, that since the 1990s, repatriations from Scottish museums have been remarkably uncontentious, particularly in contrast to the well-publicized rejection of the initial request for the return of the ghost dance shirt in 1995. Despite the small number of cases, repatriation is now seen as a normal part of the role of museums in Scotland. However, the second decade, end of quote, the second decade of the 21st century initially proved to be very quiet on the repatriation front, with hardly any recorded returns. But the third decennium has now started with a flurry of activity. By the end of 2022, there have been a further 9 cases, and this table lists all cases since 2016. It should be noted that the Hunterian can only be credited with 1 return of Maori ancestral remains in 2009, but we are working on a range of cases currently with places as far as wide as South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, USA, Jamaica, and Ireland. The University of Aberdeen took it upon itself to become the first museum in the world to return a so-called pen in bronze from its collection in October 2021, after which many museums across the world followed suit. This may be, together with the ongoing debates about the Parthenon or Elgin marbles, the most well-known instance of repatriation. But it needs to be noted that these are relatively straightforward cases and that many others are much more complicated. To finish, I want to mention a project that I led on in 2021-22, which was the development of repatriation guidance for universities and university museums globally. This project critically investigated the ethical framework for restitution and repatriation as provided by the ICOM Code of Ethics, as well as studying other relevant policies, frameworks and guidelines, specifically the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. Amongst other things, UNDRIP paragraph 12.2 states that, and I quote, states shall seek to enable the access and or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous people concerned. The guidance works from the assumption that the desirability of the return of human remains to source communities, and more broadly, to deeply reconsider objects acquired in the context of colonial domination or war, following decades of activism by Indigenous people in former colonized countries, is now minimally challenged in the international museum community. The project used university collections as case study examples to develop guidance for restitution and repatriation. The guidance was approved by ICOM UMEC by the end of 2021 and published early 2022. The guidance is also considered in the context of the current revision of the ICOM Code of Ethics. Many experts from the museum field and from originating communities from across the world have contributed to the development of this guidance. In an iterative process, evolving versions have been discussed and scrutinized by these experts, taking into account the state of art in policies, procedures, and processes for restitution and repatriation that were emerging in the world and are as we speak. The guidance contains a set of concrete recommendations for universities and their museums to inform the development of policy and practice. And you can find the full guidance and a 1.5-hour video on it through the link that I will drop in the chat. Now, that is probably way too much information already, but there is much more to share and much is left unsaid. That will have to wait for another time. I thank you for your attention and see you next time.